The man dug into his grandfather's grave because his grandmother's mysterious instructions. What he uncovered beneath the surface made him cry out in shock. "Funny, isn't it?" Marco whispered, his voice barely audible over the faint rustle of leaves in the cemetery. How someone can leave such a heavy silence behind, yet it fills every corner of you. His gaze lingered on the headstone, but his focus was elsewhere, adrift in the haze of grief that dulled the world around him. Muted condolences blended into the damp chill of the air, the shuffle of footsteps fading like a distant hum. Marco felt detached, as if standing on the edge of a memory he couldn't fully grasp. His grandmother had been more than family. She was the steady rhythm in the chaos of his life. After losing his parents so abruptly, her small, welcoming home had become his refuge, a place where the aroma of freshly baked bread mingled with the soft crackle of old vinyl records. Now that warmth was extinguished, and the emptiness it left behind was unbearable. "She wanted you to have this." The voice was soft, almost hesitant. Marco turned to find an elderly woman standing behind him. She wore a simple coat that was a bit too large, her grey hair pulled back into a bun. But it was her eyes that caught his attention, strikingly blue, as if they could see right through him. "Excuse me?" Marco blinked, realizing he hadn't caught what she'd said. The woman held out a weathered envelope in her wrinkled hand. "Your grandmother asked me to give this to you. She made me promise." Marco hesitated, his fingers hovering over the envelope. It looked fragile, as though the weight of its contents had worn it down over time. Finally, he took it, his voice low. "Thank you." "I didn't get your name." "Martha," she replied simply, a faint smile tugging at her lips before she disappeared into the thinning crowd. Back in the solitude of his small apartment, Marco sat at the kitchen table. The envelope lay in front of him like a ghost, its presence unnerving. The weight of the day, the funeral, the loss pressed heavily on his chest, but his curiosity about the envelope's contents was stronger. Running a hand through his hair, he let out a slow breath before picking it up. The paper tore with a soft whisper, revealing a single sheet of cream-colored paper. His grandmother's handwriting, familiar but shaky from her later years, filled the page. "Marco, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer with you, but I need you to know that my love for you hasn't ended. It never will. There's something important you need to do, something I couldn't tell you while I was alive. You must go to your grandfather's grave. Dig beneath the surface, and you'll find something that will change everything. Trust me, my dear, but whatever you find, think carefully before making any decisions." Marco read the letter twice, then a third time. He frowned as he set it down, the words echoing in his mind. Dig beneath the surface. The phrase felt heavier than it should, carrying an air of mystery and unease. His grandfather's grave. He hadn't been there in years. The man had died long before Marco was born, leaving behind little more than stories of a hard-working farmer with an uncanny knack for fixing anything with his hands. Why would his grandmother point him there now? For a moment, Marco considered ignoring the letter altogether. It sounded ridiculous, didn't it? Digging up a grave based on a cryptic instruction in a letter? But then his grandmother's soft yet firm voice filled his mind, quieting his doubts. "Trust me, my dear." He couldn't ignore it. The following afternoon, Marco stood in front of the weathered headstone at Oakwood Cemetery. The overcast sky matched his mood, casting long shadows over the uneven ground. He'd brought a small shovel tucked awkwardly under one arm and wore an old jacket that smelled faintly of mothballs. Standing at the edge of the grave, he felt the cold air nip at his skin. The soil beneath his boots was unyielding, almost as if it resisted the intrusion he was about to make. Gripping the shovel tightly, he found its weight strangely comforting despite the tension in his chest. Her voice lingered in his thoughts, steady and kind, urging him forward. It didn't make the task any easier. Each strike of the shovel against the earth felt wrong, like a violation of a sacred space meant to remain undisturbed. Yet, with every scoop of dirt tossed aside, his curiosity grew stronger. What could possibly lie beneath his grandfather's grave to justify such a secret? The sun had dipped low, painting the horizon in hues of orange and purple. Marco wiped the sweat from his brow, his breaths growing heavier as the mound of dirt beside him grew. The steady rhythm of his digging lulled his mind, drawing him into memories of the stories his grandmother used to tell about his grandfather. "Your grandfather, James, could fix just about anything," she would say, her voice softened by a nostalgic smile. It didn't matter if it was a broken clock or a broken heart. That man had a gift. Marco could still picture the way her eyes glimmered when she spoke of him, as though sharing a secret only the two of them understood. It made him wonder if this task was part of some unspoken promise between them, a puzzle left behind for him to solve. The shovel struck something solid. Marco froze, his pulse quickening. He crouched down, brushing away the remaining dirt with his hands. Beneath the soil, the faint outline of a metallic surface emerged, its edges tinged with rust. His fingers traced its contours until he found a small latch on the side. It was a door. Drawing a deep breath, Marco opened it. The hinges groaned in protest, their harsh sound cutting through the stillness of the night. A narrow staircase descended into darkness, and a faint, earthy scent wafted up to meet him. For a moment, he hesitated. The shadows below seemed alive, breathing with a silent dare for him to venture in. Tightening his grip on the flashlight he had brought, Marco flicked it on. The beam sliced through the darkness, revealing the first few steps. "You've come this far," he murmured to himself. Step by step, he descended. The walls on either side were damp, the air turning cooler with every step. The pounding of his heart echoed in his ears, each beat magnified by the confined space. When he reached the bottom, the flashlight illuminated a small chamber carved out of the earth itself. The space was unadorned, nearly empty, save for a single wooden box resting on a pedestal at its center. Cautiously, Marco approached. His footsteps were muffled by the dirt floor. The box was large, its surface worn smooth as if handled countless times. He knelt beside it, running his fingers over the lid. There were no markings, no hint of what might be inside. His hands trembled as he lifted the lid. The sight stole his breath. Stacks of bills were neatly arranged inside, bound with yellowed bands that had begun to fray with age. Beneath them were small, carefully wrapped items that glinted faintly in the flashlight's beam. Jewelry, perhaps, or family heirlooms. His gaze settled on a folded piece of paper tucked into a corner. Reaching for it, Marco unfolded the paper with care. The handwriting was unmistakable, the same elegant script that had graced his grandmother's letter. "Marco, as I write these words, you are but an unborn child, yet to see the light of day. If you've found this, it means you've shown courage and trust in me. What lies before you is more than money. It is a tool, a means to shape your life and the lives of others. But remember, its true value isn't in how it can enrich you, but in how it can bring light to those it touches. Think carefully. Trust your heart." Marco leaned back, his mind reeling. The weight of her words bore down on him, intertwining with the sight of the treasure before him. His first thought was practical. This could solve so many problems. The debts that had plagued him, the lingering burden of failed ventures. This could erase it all in an instant. But then her words echoed again. soft yet resolute. Not for your own benefit, Marco, for others. He sat there for what felt like hours. The beam of the flashlight dimmed as the night deepened above him. The temptation was undeniable, pulling at him with as much force as the doubts, gnawing away at his resolve. What if this was his chance to start fresh, to build the life he had always dreamed of? The money lay on the table, neatly stacked, almost mocking him with its mere presence. Marco stared at it, his mind spinning with possibilities. This wasn't just money, it was freedom. Freedom from the late-night phone calls, the letters, stamped final notice stuffed into his mailbox, the crushing weight of knowing he had been failing moment by moment. He reached for his notebook, flipping through pages scrawled with numbers and overdue balances. Each figure felt like a stone tied to his chest, dragging him down day after day. With this money, he could clear it all. Every cent. His grandmother's words whispered through his mind, soft yet unrelenting. "Think carefully, Marco." "I am thinking carefully," he murmured aloud, as though answering her ghost. The next day, he made the calls, one by one. The debts were paid. The voices on the other end of the line shifted from sharp and curt to polite, even apologetic. By the time the last account was settled, Marco leaned back in his chair. A weight he hadn't realized he was carrying finally lifted from his shoulders. Relief washed over him, but it didn't last long. As he looked at the money that remained, another thought crept in. What now? For years, he hadn't allowed himself to dream of anything beyond survival. But now, with the debts gone, and the world suddenly feeling a little less hostile, his mind wandered toward desires he had long buried. Dreams that had once seemed impossible. He found himself thinking about a car. Not just any car, but something sleek and powerful. The kind that turns heads and makes you feel alive just by gripping the wheel. He'd dreamed of it once, years ago, before life had crushed that part of him. By mid-afternoon, Marco was standing at the entrance of a gleaming car showroom. The scent of polished leather and fresh wax greeted him, mingling with the soft hum of smooth jazz playing in the background. Rows of immaculate vehicles stretched out before him, each one more stunning than the last. A salesman approached, his smile practiced but warm. "Looking for something in particular, sir?" Marco nodded, his eyes scanning the showroom. "Something fast and red." The salesman chuckled knowingly. "Follow me, I've got just the thing." He led Marco to a cherry-red convertible, the kind that seemed to shimmer even under the subdued showroom lights. Marco ran his hand along the sleek surface, his reflection bending with the car's curves. "This," the salesman said, gesturing proudly, "is the dream. Top-of-the-line engine, state-of-the-art interior, and a ride that'll make you feel like you own the world." Marco opened the door and slid into the driver's seat. The leather was cold against his hands, the steering wheel firm and inviting. He closed his eyes for a moment, picturing himself driving along a coastal highway, the wind in his hair, the sun warm on his face. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't realized he'd lost. Excitement. "I'll take it," he said, the words tumbling out before he could second-guess himself. The salesman's grin widened. "Excellent choice. Let me get the paperwork ready." As Marco stepped out of the showroom to grab a quick bite before finalizing the purchase, the outside world hit him like a gust of cold wind. The polished floors and bright lights of the showroom gave way to cracked sidewalks and the muted gray of an overcast sky. He didn't notice the woman at first, not until her voice cut through his thoughts. "Spare some change?" She was hunched over, wrapped in layers that did little to shield her from the biting cold. Her trembling hands extended a nearly empty cup toward him, her eyes hollow and weary. Marco paused, his hand instinctively reaching for his wallet, but something made him hesitate. His gaze drifted past her to the edge of the street, where a small boy, no older than 6 or 7, sat cross-legged on the pavement, clutching a ragged teddy bear. Further down, an elderly man was huddled beneath a threadbare blanket, his head leaning against the wall of a building. The man's breath came in visible puffs, his eyes closed as if trying to shut out the world. Marco's chest tightened. He had passed by scenes like this countless times without a second thought, but today, after everything that had happened, it felt different. The joy he'd felt in the showroom began to sour, replaced by a growing unease. "Thank you, sir," the woman said softly as Marco dropped a few bills into her cup. He kept walking, but his steps were slower now, his mind racing. His grandmother's face floated to the forefront of his thoughts, her warm yet serious eyes staring back at him. He could almost hear her voice. "Don't let greed guide your decisions." He stopped in his tracks, the hum of the city fading into the background. Back in the showroom, the salesman was waiting, papers in hand. "You're going to love this car," he said eagerly. "Just sign here and it's all yours." Marco stared at the papers for what felt like an eternity. His pen hovered over the dotted line, but he couldn't bring himself to write. "Is everything okay?" the salesman asked, his smile faltering. Marco set the pen down and shook his head. I need to think about it." The salesman frowned, but nodded. "Take your time. A car like this isn't just a purchase, it's an investment in yourself." Marco forced a polite smile, but as he walked away, he felt an unfamiliar sense of clarity. The excitement he'd felt earlier was gone, replaced by a quiet determination. He knew what he had to do. Stepping into the cold air once more, his thoughts were no longer filled with the roar of an engine or the gleam of polished chrome. Instead, he thought of the woman with the trembling hands, the boy with the tattered teddy bear, and the old man under the worn blanket. His grandmother had been right. This money wasn't just for him, it was meant to be something greater. Marco sat at his kitchen table, the stillness of the room broken only by the faint ticking of the wall clock. The remaining stacks of money lay before him, no longer a symbol of personal triumph, but something far more profound. An opportunity to rewrite not just his story, but the stories of others. Marco had made his decision, and for the first time in what felt like ages, his heart felt lighter. He began with research, jotting down names and contact information in an old notebook he found tucked away in a drawer. Local shelters, soup kitchens, youth programs, organizations he had barely noticed before now seemed to leap out at him. Each represented a unique need, a different kind of hope. It took him days of phone calls and meetings to find the right places to start. The directors he spoke to were cautious at first, their voices tinged with skepticism. But as Marco explained his intentions, their guarded tones softened. By the end of most conversations, there were promises of collaboration and heartfelt gratitude that made his earlier doubts seem distant and insignificant. His first major donation went to a shelter struggling to keep its doors open. Marco met the director, an older man named Howard, in a small office cluttered with paperwork and photographs of volunteers. Howard's face, etched with years of hardship and dedication, lit up when Marco handed him the check. "This will keep us running through the winter," Howard said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have no idea what this means to us." Marco shook his hand, feeling a warmth in the exchange that was entirely new to him. "I think I have an idea," he replied. Later that week, Marco toured the shelter. The halls echoed with the quiet shuffle of footsteps and murmured conversations, but there was an undeniable energy, a sense of life that defied despair. He watched as volunteers prepared meals and handed out blankets, their smiles genuine despite the challenges they faced. Marco didn't stay long, but as he was leaving, he noticed a young boy clutching a bowl of soup, his wide eyes filled with wonder as he sat beside his mother. The image lingered in Marco's mind, a poignant reminder of why he was doing this. Word spread faster than Marco had anticipated. The organizations he supported began sharing stories of how his contributions had turned their fortunes around, new supplies purchased, more families helped. Letters started arriving in his mailbox, filled with trembling handwriting and heartfelt thanks. One morning, as Marco sifted through the growing pile of envelopes, one in particular caught his eye. It was from a charity he had supported the previous week, a community outreach program focused on educational scholarships. Inside was a simple, handwritten note. "Dear Marco, I don't know if you realize the incredible difference you've already made. Your donation didn't just provide funds, it gave us hope. Every child we're able to help because of you is another step toward breaking the cycle of poverty in our city." With gratitude, Victoria H. Marco read the note twice, then a third time. The name Victoria stuck with him. It wasn't just the eloquence of her words or their sincerity, it was the sense of connection they stirred in him. He set the letter down, wondering who she was beyond her title as director. In the days that followed, Marco found himself drawn to Victoria's words. The way she had described hope, not as mere money or opportunity, but as something almost tangible, struck a chord in him. He had been thinking a lot about hope lately, how fragile it was, how easily it could slip away. Finally, after wrestling with his hesitation, Marco sat down and wrote a response. It was shorter than Victoria's letter, but he made sure to convey his gratitude for the work her organization was doing. Marco also thanked her for reminding him of something his grandmother had once said, that even the smallest act of kindness could ripple outward, touching lives in ways one might never see. The next morning, he mailed his letter, expecting little more than a polite acknowledgement in return. He didn't anticipate how quickly a reply would arrive. Just 3 days after sending his letter, an envelope appeared in his mailbox, the return address written in the same elegant handwriting he remembered from Victoria's first note. Marco lingered on his porch, turning the envelope over in his hands, curiosity mingling with a quiet, unspoken emotion. Inside was a letter that began as formally as he had expected, once again thanking him for his generosity. But as the paragraphs unfolded, the tone shifted, becoming warmer, more conversational. Victoria wrote about the children her organization had helped that month, including a boy who had earned his first scholarship thanks to Marco's donation. "It's moments like these," she wrote, "that remind me why I started this work. Seeing the joy on his face brought back the happiness I felt the first time someone believed in me. It's rare to find people like you who understand the power of giving, not just materially, but emotionally." Marco read the letter twice, then a third time. There was something in her words, not just their sincerity, but the sense of purpose they carried. For years, he had wandered through his own life, weighed down by failure and uncertain of what lay ahead. But Victoria seemed to know exactly where she was going, and that certainty captivated him. That night, he drafted his reply. The letters continued over the following weeks. At first, they were polite exchanges about their shared passion for helping others. But as time passed, their words grew longer, more personal. Victoria revealed glimpses of her own struggles, how she had grown up in a neighborhood much like the ones her organization now served. How a teacher had seen her potential and encouraged her to dream beyond her circumstances. In turn, Marco found himself opening up in ways he hadn't anticipated. He told her about his grandmother, about the quiet strength she had instilled in him, and how her voice still guided him in moments of doubt. He even wrote about the box of money and the weight of the decisions it had brought. "I almost kept it all for myself," he confessed in one letter. "I thought it might be my chance to escape, to finally live the life I dreamed of. But then I remembered her. I remembered how much she believed in me, and I realized I couldn't let her down." Victoria's response came swiftly, filled with understanding. "The fact that you wrestled with that decision doesn't make you weak, Marco. It makes you human. What matters is the choice you ultimately made. You chose to honor her memory, and in doing so, you've already changed countless lives." The first time Victoria suggested they meet, Marco hesitated. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the vulnerability he felt after sharing so much through their letters, or the fear that meeting her in person might disrupt the connection they had built. But her next letter included an invitation he couldn't ignore. "Next week, we're hosting a small event at one of our new youth centers. It's nothing formal, just a chance for some of the families to see what we've built together. I'd love for you to come. It would mean so much to everyone here to meet the person who made it all possible." Marco read the invitation over and over, his nerves tangled with curiosity. Finally, he folded the letter carefully and placed it on his desk. The youth center was small, but brimming with life. Marco arrived early, his hands buried in the pockets of his jacket, watching the volunteers set up tables and chairs. Laughter echoed from the children running in the courtyard, their energy contagious, even from a distance. "Marco?" The voice was warm and familiar, even though he'd never heard it aloud before. Turning, he saw Victoria approaching. She was younger than he'd imagined, perhaps in her mid-30s, but there was a wisdom in her eyes that made her seem older. Her smile was genuine, her hand extended. "It's so good to finally meet you," she said, her handshake firm yet gentle. Marco found himself smiling, the tension in his shoulders easing. "Likewise, this place is amazing." "It's thanks to you," Victoria replied, motioning toward the building. "Come on, let me show you around." As they walked, Victoria explained the programs the center offered: mentoring sessions, art classes, even a small library funded by donations. Marco listened intently, though his focus often drifted to the way her face lit up as she spoke. It wasn't just pride in the work, it was something deeper. The center wasn't just a project, it was a part of her, woven into every word and gesture. By the time the event began, Marco felt more at ease than he had in months. He mingled with families, listened to their stories, and watched as Victoria moved effortlessly between groups. Her presence was a calming force amidst the lively chaos. At one point, a young girl approached him shyly, holding a handmade card. "Thank you for helping us," she said softly, her wide eyes earnest. Marco crouched to her level, accepting the card with a smile. "You're welcome, but it's not just me. It's all of us working together." The girl nodded solemnly before running off to join her friends. As Marco stood, his eyes met Victoria's across the room. She was watching him. Her expression was unreadable, but warm. For a moment, neither of them moved, the noise of the event fading into the background. The weeks that followed blurred into a steady rhythm of work and companionship. Marco and Victoria spent more time together, their conversations effortlessly weaving between their shared passion for the center's projects and the quieter, more personal details of their lives. One afternoon, as they reviewed plans for a new scholarship program, Marco found himself watching Victoria as she spoke. Her hands moved animatedly, her enthusiasm spilling into every word. It was in those moments when she was completely lost in her purpose that Marco realized how deeply he admired her. But admiration wasn't the only feeling that had taken root. There was something else, something softer, that crept in when she laughed at one of his jokes or absent-mindedly tucked her hair behind her ear in that way she always did. Their connection deepened during a trip to a nearby city to visit a struggling shelter. The long drive gave them hours to talk, and Marco found himself sharing stories he'd never told anyone before. Stories about his parents, about the loneliness that followed their loss, about the unexpected gift his grandmother had left him. Victoria listened intently, her hand resting lightly on the armrest between them. "You've been through so much," she said quietly when he finished, "and yet here you are, turning that pain into something beautiful." Marco looked at her, his chest tight. "I think it's easier to do that when you're not alone." For a moment, Victoria didn't respond, but her gaze held his, steady and understanding. As the months passed, their friendship deepened into something unspoken yet undeniable. Words were no longer needed to fill the spaces between them. A glance, a shared smile, or the quiet comfort of sitting together over late-night coffee was enough. Marco began to picture a future, not just his own, but one with Victoria by his side. He imagined them working together, building something meaningful, something lasting. For the first time in years, he felt hope, untainted by hesitation or doubt. The night he decided to tell her was unusually warm for early winter. They had spent the day handing out blankets and hot meals to people living on the streets, their hands raw and numb from the cold, even with gloves. As they walked back to their office, Victoria shivered slightly, pulling her coat tighter around herself. "Let me take you to dinner," Marco offered. Victoria glanced at him, her smile playful. "Is that an invitation or a bribe to stop working late?" "Call it whatever you want, as long as you say yes." She laughed, the sound light and carefree, and nodded. "Fine, but I'm picking the place." They ended up at a small restaurant tucked away on a quiet street, the kind of spot that smelled of coffee and grilled cheese, instantly making you feel at home. They chose a corner table, their conversation flowing as easily as always. But as the meal came to an end, Marco felt the weight of his thoughts pressing on him. He watched Victoria as she stirred sugar into her tea. "Victoria," he began, his voice steady despite the racing of his heart. She looked up, her brow creasing slightly. "What is it?" "I need to tell you something," he said, leaning forward. You've changed my life in ways I didn't think were possible. And it's not just the work we're doing. It's you. You make me want to be better, to do better. I don't think I've ever felt this way before. Not about anyone." Victoria stared at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Marco feared he had said too much. But then her lips parted, and she let out a soft sigh. "Marco," she started, but he interrupted, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I don't want to just be your partner in this work. I want to be your partner in everything." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "I want to spend the rest of my life building something with you, not just for others, but for us. Victoria, will you marry me?" The silence that followed felt endless, but then Victoria smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Of course, yes." The morning of the wedding dawned soft and golden, the kind of day that carried the promise of something extraordinary. Marco stood in the center of the community garden, adjusting the cuffs of his jacket as the first guests began to arrive. The air buzzed with quiet anticipation. The rows of flowers they had planted months ago were now in full bloom, vibrant and alive, a fitting backdrop for the vows they were about to exchange. The ceremony was simple, just as they had wanted. Members of the community they had served gathered in a loose semicircle around the open clearing in the garden. There were no ornate decorations or elaborate fanfare, just the natural beauty of the space and the hum of warmth from the people who had been part of their journey. Marco's breath caught when Victoria appeared, her arm linked with a close friend who escorted her down the makeshift aisle. She wore a dress as unpretentious as she was, a soft ivory gown with lace details that caught the sunlight. But it was her expression that held him captive. Her smile was radiant, her eyes locked on his. In that moment, Marco felt the world narrow to just the two of them. Their vows were heartfelt and deeply personal, reflecting the journeys that had brought them to this moment. Marco spoke of the transformation he had undergone, of how Victoria had not only inspired him, but helped him rediscover the man he aspired to be. "You've given me more than I ever thought I deserved," he said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "With you, I've found not just love, but purpose. I promise to stand by you in everything we build, in all we give, for as long as we live." Victoria's words were equally moving. She spoke of how Marco had reminded her of the power of connection, of how his kindness and determination had reignited her belief in what they could accomplish together. "When I look at you," she said softly, her voice carrying across the garden, "I don't just see a partner. I see a home. With you, I know we can do more than dream. We can make those dreams real, for us and for others." When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the applause was thunderous. Marco took Victoria's hands in his heart brimming as he kissed her, sealing their vows with the quiet certainty of someone who knew he had found where he belonged. The reception was held right there in the garden, with long tables set beneath strings of twinkling lights. Instead of traditional wedding gifts, the guests had contributed to an emergency housing fund that Marco and Victoria had established in lieu of a registry. Throughout the evening, there were toasts and laughter, stories shared over plates of homemade food, and a sense of camaraderie that deepened as the night wore on. Victoria moved effortlessly through the crowd, her magnetic presence drawing people in as she thanked her guests and listened to their stories. From across the table, Marco watched her, his chest swelling with pride and love. At one point, Howard, the director of the first shelter Marco had ever supported, stood to give a toast. "To Marco and Victoria," he began, raising his glass. "You've shown all of us what it means to give, not just your resources, but your hearts. Today isn't just about your union. It's about what that union represents, a promise to continue lifting others, even as you lift each other, for a love that inspires us all." The crowd erupted into cheers, glasses clinking as Victoria leaned into Marco's side, her smile pressed against his shoulder. In the weeks that followed the wedding, Marco and Victoria threw themselves back into their work with renewed energy. The projects they had once pursued separately now felt seamless as they combined their visions, their skills complementing each other in ways neither had anticipated. One of their first joint initiatives was to expand the scholarship program Victoria had founded, broadening its reach to underfunded schools in neighboring cities. Together, they visited classrooms, spoke with teachers, and listened to their needs, brainstorming ideas to provide not just financial support, but lasting solutions. Marco thrived in this partnership, not just as Victoria's husband, but as her equal in the mission they now shared. He had always believed in the power of giving, But with Victoria at his side, he saw how that power could multiply, how their combined efforts could drive change on a scale neither could have achieved alone. Their days were packed with meetings, site visits, and endless conversations about how to do more. But even amidst the bustle, they carved out time for the small moments that kept them grounded: quiet dinners at home, evening walks through the neighborhood, and hours spent dreaming up new ideas at the kitchen table. One evening, as they sat together reviewing plans for a new community center, Marco paused, his pen hovering over the page. "You know," Marco said, looking across the table at Victoria, "I never imagined I'd end up here. Not just with this work, but with you. Sometimes it still feels surreal." Victoria smiled, reaching out to place her hand over his. "I think that's the beauty of it," she replied. "We couldn't have planned this, even if we'd tried. But here we are, and it feels right." Marco squeezed her hand, his heart swelling with gratitude, not just for her, but for the journey that had brought them together. As word of their efforts spread, more people began to take notice. Local businesses stepped forward to sponsor their programs, and volunteers from across the region reached out, eager to be part of something meaningful. Marco and Victoria worked tirelessly, but they made a point to highlight the contributions of those around them. They understood that real change came from collective action. Their garden wedding had become a local legend, a symbol of what could be achieved when love and purpose intertwined. People didn't just see it as the union of two individuals, they spoke of it as the starting point of a movement that was transforming lives. For Marco and Victoria, the work was never about recognition. It was about the faces they saw in the shelters, the heartfelt letters they received from scholarship recipients, and the quiet gratitude of a single mother clutching the keys to her new apartment. Each of those moments reminded them why they had chosen this path, and each other. Marco's journey is a deeply moving exploration of personal redemption, love, and the transformative power of altruism. What makes his story truly captivating is the layered complexity of his character. He starts as a man weighed down by his past failures, tempted by the allure of wealth as a way to escape his struggles. Yet, through the echoes of his grandmother's wisdom and moments of profound clarity, he chooses a path of giving over greed. Marco's evolution is not instantaneous. It is marked by doubts, hesitations, and small but significant steps toward a greater purpose. This slow transformation is what makes his journey so relatable and powerful. The turning point, where he decides to abandon self-indulgence for a cause bigger than himself, underscores the enduring impact of compassion and moral guidance. Victoria's introduction enriches the narrative, not just as a romantic interest, but as a partner who shares and amplifies Marco's vision. Together, they build a life filled with purpose, demonstrating how love and a shared mission can drive meaningful change. This story resonates because it reminds us of the extraordinary potential within ordinary people. Marco's decision to focus on helping others instead of pursuing personal gain reflects a universal truth. True fulfillment comes not from accumulating wealth, but from making a difference in the lives of others. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey through Marco and Victoria's inspiring story. It's a powerful reminder of how love, purpose, and selflessness can create ripples of change in the lives of so many. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who might need a little inspiration today. We'd love to hear from you. How did this story move you? Drop a comment below and let us know. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you won't miss more stories like this. Together, let's keep spreading positivity and hope. Thank you for being a part of our community, and as always, may you be blessed and guided in every step of your journey. See you in the next video.